Welcome everyone to another Saturday morning in our art clinic online. We are happy to have Sondra N. Arkin, who has been a DC icon. I'm going to call you an icon because you are. For, gosh, as long as I can remember, I actually became familiar with Sondra's work actually at Longview Gallery, where we both actually exhibited for, I don't know if you're still there or not, but for a time period. I remember being in exhibitions like the Refresh 4, maybe I forget what other ones we were both part of, and being just enamored with these kind of, they look like systematic with lines and circles and these kind of little systems of forms. And they were like a Bryce Martin painting that had a lot of depth of wax and shellac and ink, and they were just absolutely gorgeous jewels. And I was enamored with these pieces. They were phenomenal. So hopefully we'll get to see some of that work today. Sondra's just off one of her, I'd say, more important maybe shows, larger shows at the Katzen Art Museum, where she talks, the exhibition was called The Human Flood, and the work was centered around the idea of climate change and people having to flee their countries based on climate change. So I hope you had a chance to go take a look at that exhibition because it was pretty awesome. I don't know you two personally, but I'm such a fan of your work, and I've been following Sondra for, oh gosh, since Longview time. So without further ado, I will pass the torch to her, and so she can talk about her incredible work. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Mariana, for having me be part of this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what to look for in my work, and then I'm going to go through a lot of slides of different kinds of work, and we'll have questions later. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation because it'll help keep me on track and race through that way. So let me do that. Okay, so about my person. So like a lot of Washington artists, I come to art as a second career or third career or something like that. I went to college for science, and it didn't work out for me in science. It was a challenge for me in science. Actually, the words were really hard, and I came out with a degree in writing and literature and went on to get a graduate degree in literature as well. I did a fellowship at the Mystic Seaport Museum and studied sea fiction and maritime history and navigation and music. And did a stint teaching on a wooden sailing vessel, but even putting that together with dry land adjunct teaching, I thought that university would be a really great opportunity for a career. I really couldn't make ends meet, and I ended up in a career in high-tech marketing. And how this all fits together, I think, comes through a little bit in my work. You'll see. I'm really process driven, and I think that that has a lot to do with why I'm interested in science and the environment and how it works with my work. I'm very curious about systems and organization and data networks, and I tend to think about things for a while before I pop into them. And I consider myself an explorer. I make a lot of work that is experimental, and I teach myself a lot of the work. Even though my degrees are in literature, I was really lucky that I took a full load of classes as an undergraduate in art. I just don't have a degree in it. And then later, when I taught at the universities, I was able to take graduate level classes. So I've taken a lot of classes, but I've always been I was always an outsider in the art classes. And so I think that I had to learn how to self-critique in a particular way. I'm very committed to the environment. And so a lot of my work either is about that, or it uses repurposed materials or reused or recycled materials. And that's become even more important to me in the last 5 years. And I added this little line of many hands make light work because I really like to work with other people. And I believe that and I think that it comes out in my art because I think that the individual the individuals combined make something bigger. So this idea of many hands make light work is actually sort of fundamental to the work that I do. In my work, I think the things that you should look for as we go through these slides are the idea of boundaries and connections, the connections for me between people and things. And boundaries is always what is along the edges is important. Grids and networks and organizations are fundamental to the kind of work that I do. I'm looking at things from a macro and a micro viewpoint, which means that my work might not be about anything because it's process driven, it's circles and lines, but for you, it might look like cells, but it might also look like the cosmos. And that is really, that's a really important concept for me. And I think you should think about the fact that I'm always looking below the surface and what is coming from the surface. I call them surface eruptions. And this is true in 2D or in 3D work. The idea of multiples is really important to me. Again, it's this idea of adding up singular items to make a bigger item. And the permutations is all the ways you can take an idea. And again, the micro macro, because it fits in with that. And micro macro also has to do for me with scale. We were talking, Jordan and Mariana, when I first started, that for the scale, I like intimate work, but I also really like big work. And for me, the way to do that is often putting together smaller works. And I do use materiality to explore these ideas, whether it's trying new materials or however it's done. So I'm going to start with this very early work. These are called blue squares, and people might recognize them. I showed blue square paintings actually at the first Artomatic that I showed at here in Washington. And in the late 90s, when I was considering how to transition from the career that I had in high-tech marketing and to an art career, I put some rules in place for myself because I felt like my work was really pretty generic. It looked like anybody else's abstract work. So I put this rule in place that I was only going to use blue. And I know these are called blue squares. There really aren't any squares in them, and they're not square, but I made about 40 or so of these paintings that are 50 by 40. They're oil on canvas. And I just kept making these iterations. And I think for me, I was actually looking for a window and a door out of where I was. So it was personally really significant body of work. I made these oil paintings, I made work on paper, and it really helped me through this transition. And in 2002, I moved into the studio I'm in now in DuPont Circle, and I continued to make oil paintings for a while. So these oil paintings, I'm just showing a couple of them, all have this sort of complementary tension and this luminous quality. And again, for me, it's this matter of trying to look into something a little bit. And I was really trying to make these oil paintings be both very flat and very deep. And so I just kept painting these grids of complementary colors in an effort to find my voice, actually. So some of the work also then just started showing right through the paintings. These have blue as their undercoat, and then the painting is on top of it. I never really liked working on canvas, and I was looking for some other hard surfaces. I worked on wood. I worked on dye bond. Concurrently, I was also making watercolors. I've always made watercolors. I love to make watercolors. And I made this whole series of watercolors called Defining Spaces, where the colors didn't touch. Again, these very high colored pieces, very colorful. You can see that there's still some blue squares in here, but that all of these pieces, the colors don't touch. You can see vaguely, I think, in this work. It's hard on the slide, but there are these sort of incised lines through my watercolors. This is a recurring theme, again, of trying to find your place in the world, maybe. You know, what's the foreground, what's the background? I did the same thing with oil pastels, also in this early aughts era. This is from a series called Blue Foundation, where the oil pastels are on a ground that is marble dust, and it's sort of brushstroke to look like a wood grain, and then the oil pastels are on top of them. The same sort of grids, not really any change to what I'm making, but again, trying really hard to find a medium by which you could look into the pieces. I did it in a color block series. I made a good deal of these. So all through the early aughts, that first decade, I would be experimenting with this idea of pushing and pulling the color into the background and out of the background of the pieces. At this time, I also started working with encaustic, and encaustic really ended up being what I loved to work with. These are some of the early pieces that I made with encaustic. These are pieces on paper. I worked on 300-pound paper. Encaustic needs to be on a stiff media, and so that was my way of making it really stiff, was a really heavy paper. And I worked to the edge. I had some that didn't go to the edge, but fundamentally, what's interesting to me about these pieces is that I went back to blue squares. You know, I had these hovering blue squares that ended up being in all of these early encaustics. Also at the beginning of in the beginning of the aughts, I should say, I was working, I was on the board of Artomatic, and I also, because of the board of Artomatic, got asked to curate the Wilson Building collection for the DC Arts Commission. And I was looking at a lot of art around the same time that I did this show. And I was working with the Nevin Kelly Gallery at that time. That's who represented me. And Nevin was great because he would let me bring an idea. And I brought this idea that I wanted to do this show with Mary Beth Ramsey, a friend of mine, where we would do all text-based work. I really wanted to sort of work that out of my system. And one of the things that I tell people about working with encaustic is you can do anything with encaustic. You know, it's the most flexible media. You can do collage, you can do transfers, you can do constructions, you can do dimensional work. And when you're first learning encaustic, you do all those things. And I wanted to sort of work them out of my system. And I was looking at a lot of work for the Arts Commission, and I wanted to figure out how to find my voice without being too derivative of other people's work. So these pieces in particular are one of the first appearances of where I've found something that I wanted to make, and I made like thousands of these little tags, and then I attached them to pieces. So the one that's on the left is called Kinetic Exegesis, and it's a Bible study, and it's about 5 inches by 5 inches by 5. And this is the book of Revelation that I have attached to this piece. And then the pieces on the right are other books. So one's the dictionary, one is a congressional hearing on nuclear disarmament. Now you not only look into the piece, but you have the piece coming out towards you. These are 2 other pieces from that show I wanted to show quickly. Another Bible piece on the left. It's hard to see in the picture, but there's about 30 sheets of paper that have been waxed and smushed and then laid out and stacked. So there's about 1 inch coming up, and then there's a glass piece with resin in the middle, a sort of iceberg. And this is the Genesis story of Jonah and the whale. And again, I was just experimenting with like all the ways that you could go crazy with encaustic and constructions. On the right, you see one of my first, what I would consider one of my first really successful dye bond pieces. This is a wax piece. It's completely wax. There's no legal paper in this piece. It's created out of wax, and it's got transfers on it. And it's actually a piece that was devoted to my mom. It's her shorthand on it. So I just love that piece. I don't actually know where it ended up. Sold through the gallery. The next year, there was a citywide project called Color School Remix. And I did this show at Nevin Kelly's. And I also participated in a community project by where we we painted the street in honor of Gene Davis. That was a really fun community project. But for the piece that I did for this, I made these pieces also with these rules where I restricted my colors, and then we painted sections of the gallery walls and hung pieces on these different colors, but you could also move them around from one place to another. This is really the last show, I think, where I had these high color complementary contrasts, but it's also the first show where I'm working in these constructs. So the pieces that are on the right are these 12 by 12 by 6-inch boxes that I made. And I continued to work with these tags and tied them to these boxes. And this is a little bit closer view of them. They also use copper leaf. For me, copper is all about connections. And these pieces were all about connections as well. I put the piece on the right in there so you could see the sort of crazy ass knot tying. So each one of these pieces, it's a good example also of how I really like to make efficiencies in my work. And so I made a big jig by which it was a piece of wood that had notches in it, and you could tie the hemp around this piece of wood. And then I would take strips of paper that had gloss medium on them, and you would slide it under the string, and then you'd put another one on top, and you would fuse them together with an iron, and then you cut it all apart. And so each time you did it, you would make about 50 tags. Well, actually, you made 100 tags on each one. And then each individual tag got dipped in wax, and you'd have to take the wax off of it. So I had like really blistered little fingers from them. It was like a little insane project. I don't really know why, but I love doing it. It was very meditative. I like doing work where there's that kind of repetition in it. And so again, that's why I thought it would be interesting to look at this as the context of making that kind of thing. Concurrently, I was trying to figure out how to make the encaustics larger. And so I started working on dye bond. It was much lighter than working on a wood background. And these are 4 foot by 4 foot. I get 4 foot by 8 foot pieces of dye bond. And so all of my sizes are really an efficiency out of how you cut up the dye bond. And these pieces are still showing this sort of high complementary contrast, but I'm trying to find ways to let the texture do some of the push-pull of the piece, I think. And when I first started working with the dye bond, you had to attach canvas or paper or linen or something to dye bond. It's aluminum, and you can't work directly on aluminum with wax. Subsequently, R&F, which is a encaustic manufacturer, came out with a gesso, which made it a lot easier. But I really wanted to find a way to get the pieces to be bigger. So this is a show at the Black Rock Center for the Arts, and these pieces are called macro, micro, and so they were really big pieces about really small things. Again, sort of the saying goodbye to the kind of colors that I would be using. So I guess that's sort of like the end of that first decade. I went through an awful lot. These pieces are showing where I start working on these environmental pieces. I stopped with the grid so much and started working on these linear creations of environments. These are part of an ecoscape series that I did. I was hoping you'd be able to see a little bit more of the dimension in this, so I threw in an extra slide for you where you could see the lines that are above this. So these lines are all created out of wax, and they're on wax pieces. I then did a project I've been working with Susan Finson and Ellen Weiss. We were one of the first people to show at the Gateway Art Center. There was this new center in Brentwood, and we all wanted to work a little bit bigger. And so we proposed this show where we were going to do big work. The piece that's in the middle is a 48 by 48 inch panel. And there were 3 things that came out of this show that I think are really fundamental for my work. The three of us met every week for about 6 months and just made stuff. We played and we made things. And so on the left, you see a picture where there's a construction, and those are rusted styrofoam bits. And we would go to community forklift and forage things. And one of the things we found was a roll of rebar tie wire. And from that, I started making these cloud forms. I call them turkeys because they're about the size of a turkey, and you'll see them a little bit more later. And Susan and Ellen weren't really interested in making those pieces. It was a sort of crazy weaving of wire, of this steel wire. And so I asked them if I could continue, if they would mind if I continued making them. And they were like, sure. So I made about 20 of them for this show, and subsequently made a total of 600 of those pieces for a show at American University in 2017. In the background of that piece on the left, you can see these linear pieces that start to come over in my work. And then the piece in the middle and the image on the right is this first grouping of these panels, where I started working on these 16 by 16 panel arrangements. And I was excited to do these pieces. I started to work with wax with no pigment in it, and putting the pigment in shellac and layering shellac and wax together. So the pigment is totally out of the wax. And I started from about this time to only use wax that was clear. And that really made a difference, clear as, wax can be. So then I started working at Longview Gallery, which, as Jordan can tell you, is like, the best space ever. And I did this show called Pattern Transformation. And in the Pattern Transformation show was the first time I showed my permutation toward infinity panels in that conceit, I guess you'd call it. When I was working on these panels, I had 9 of them hung in my studio, and I thought, oh, how exciting. I bet there's a lot of permutations of how you can arrange them. The dye bond that I have is on a strainer on the back that has bevels on it, and so you can turn it in any direction. And so a grid of 9, you can turn all the pieces into individual positions, right? So you can go any of 4 positions, and then it can go in any of the 9 places, because it doesn't really matter. It's always different. And so I thought, oh, that's exciting. It must be hundreds of permutations. And then I thought, oh, you know what? It must be thousands of permutations. And so I contacted some friends who were professors, one of physics and one in mechanical engineering, and they came back to me both with the same answer and taught me how to do a permutation calculation. And it was 95 billion calculated permutations. And I was like, wow, that's just crazy that these 9 pieces could be arranged in 95 billion ways. And then I calculated that out. And if you looked at it for like 1 second in each permutation, you could not see all the permutations in a lifetime. And I don't know, I became fascinated with this concept of time and looking at artwork. So this Pattern Transformation show, which you're probably not supposed to say any show is your favorite, but this was definitely like one of my favorite shows, because I had so many breakthroughs of how the making of the work related to time, how the looking at the work related to time, and what you could do with all of this permutation. So that was pretty exciting. These are some of the permutations. On the left is an installation that's actually down at the Marriott Marquis. And I did about 180, almost 200 of the permutation panels. And I did another group that was 32 inches by 32 inches. That was a whole other, yeah. And so meanwhile, I'm like making this wire in my studio, these steel wire pieces. And so I thought I'd show some pictures where you can see the wire a little bit more closely. In that second from the right image, you can see an individual piece. So you sort of get the size, and I'm showing you the wishbones on that piece with my hand. So you can see that this is pieces, how they're linked together. So the individual wire pieces have 3 loops, and then you're just connecting them. And so it ends up being woven together. I like this picture in the middle, which shows you like all of the little wishbones that as I'm making them, because first you have to cut the wire, then you have to like loop the wire, then you have to put the loops on the end, and then you have to put them all together. And yeah, another sort of crazy project, I guess. I showed those wire pieces for the first time in a bigger assortment at Longview as part of this network show that I did with Eve Stockton. And it was nice. At Longview, they don't really show dimensional work, but because all this work could be attached to the wall, I was able to show the work there. And as a result of this show, that's where Jack Rasmussen saw this work and invited me to participate in American University and at the Stone Tower, actually. So both of those. The American University show with Joan and Mary was like super fun. It was a great show. They were really great people to work with. And these are the 2 pieces that I did for that show. On the right is a piece called Mist. So for this show, I made 600 of the turkeys, and I showed up with them in garbage bags, 10 in a bag. And I really had I mean, I had an idea of what I was doing, of course. I had sketched it out, but then it's all site specific. So it's made on site, and it is made in about 4 days. We'd asked for 2 weeks, and somehow, I don't know, it got abbreviated. What can I say? So the piece Mist that's on the right, I really wanted people to be able to get inside the work. So now I went from looking in the work or having the work come out towards you to wanting people to be able to be in the work. And in the case of the piece Mist, I wanted it to look like it was rising up. So it rises out of these puddles and attaches to the wall. And the piece on the left is called Cloud Forest. And these are individual hanging pieces. And somehow I got it in my head that we should suspend them on motors. So there are actually motors on most of these, and they have motion detectors on them or timers, and so they turn very slowly as you walk among them. And this was a super exciting show because I really feel like it accomplished this idea of getting inside the artwork. And the thing about the steel wire is it's really hard to photograph, and the shadows are really important to the work. So it's important to see it in real life. I don't think it translates as well in photographs, but that was a really great show and opportunity. And so, as I said, I made 600 of these turkeys for it, and I only have about 200 left. So, if you want a bunch of turkeys, I'm happy to come do a site installation because I'd like to get the rest of them out there. And then this idea of time and how we factor into the time. I was talking to Barbara Warden about it, and she invited me to participate in a show at the Delaware Art Museum called Impermanence, which she was doing based on the Buddhist idea of impermanence, life, and mortality. And so at first I did 9 of these drawings that are, these are all, I covered paper with charcoal and then I removed most of it with erasers. So these are drawn with erasers as opposed to drawn around the piece with some lines added to it. But when she came to my studio, I asked her if they might consider a drawing in space for part of the show. So we included one of the steel wire pieces. And I really love this piece also because it's a vessel at the bottom. It's also impossible to see in photographs, but it's a vessel and you can look inside it. And I thought that the idea of a vessel in this show that was about impermanence and what you try to contain, and a vessel that was made out of this steel wire that actually couldn't contain anything, was a pretty interesting idea for me. And I actually recreated this vessel in New York at a recycle show. And at the Washington Project for the Arts, in one of the not strictly painting shows, I created a vessel like this, which is this vessel that doesn't really function as a vessel. I did another collaboration with another friend who is a mechanical engineer, was a mechanical engineering professor, and we had gotten into a heated discussion about STEM versus STEAM curriculum. And I suggested that he take a sabbatical from his work and we do an art project together. He's pretty artsy. And so he did, and they actually funded this project, and we did this show at Art Enables in 2019. And it was actually really, I mean, I really like working on collaborations, and collaborations can go so many ways, right? They can be you're over here and I'm over here, or we work on something together. But I think you very rarely work together on a collaborative project. And there were pieces of this that we did together, but it was very much a you're over here and I'm over here, which wasn't how I thought an engineer and an artist would work together. But for us, what came out of the show much more was how much engineering went into art and how much art went into engineering. The image that's on the left shows the back of a door, which has a soundboard on it, has a sound piece on it. And when you stepped on that piece of wood and you went through the door, it activated this sound piece. This is also what I made the original bamboo showers for, which I showed at Artomatic this last year. They were really popular. And we made collaboratively the piece that's on the right, which are these sticks that are in a platform we made, and there's nothing holding them up except the holes that we made for it. And I actually really loved that piece and the making of that piece together. So, and there's one other piece in this. If you look all the way through the image, there's some hanging blue things. They're impossible to see really, but I worked with Helen Frederick to make paper out of shredded financial documents. And then I made these logs, which I actually intended to use in the human flood and didn't use in the human flood, but it was a great experience working with Helen, and that was a really great collaboration. So some other collaborations, I did some screen prints with Dennis O'Neill, and Dennis was a great guy to work with, and he really helped me take some leaps off of a cliff. And I wanted to work with Dennis because he was working with wax in his screen printing. And I wanted to see, again, if I could translate these ideas of looking in and looking out in a screen print environment. So these are part of two different variable print editions. The ones in the middle are one, and the ones on the side are part of another. And you can see they're really variable. They're all very different, but it was a really great experience, and they have some texture to them. They're great prints. Another print project that I worked on was with the Millennium Art Salon, did a print project in 2010 where Sam Gilliam had invited artists to participate, and it was a multi-generational, multi-racial, multi-ethnic kind of project. And it was a great experience working at the George Mason Print Center. And again, I was really trying to see if I could bring the ideas of these layers into these prints. And the print that's on the left was part of the show that traveled around the East Coast. And actually the print on the right was just acquired as part of a portfolio by the Library of Congress, acquired a portfolio earlier this year. So this was a really exciting print collaboration. And I thought it would be good to talk about those prints before we got into the human flood, because the human flood had a really big print component to it. And a lot of people asked me if I'd ever done printmaking before this. So I thought, yes, I have done some printmaking. So these are a bunch of different images from the human flood. We have a website for the human flood called thehumanflood.com, where you can see all these projects a lot in detail. But in essence, it was the 5th collaboration that Ellen has done with different artists in Washington. And I was with her on the last climate change project that she did. And at that time, we thought about the human flood component, which is what happens to the people who have to leave their homes because of climate change, and what are we doing to support those people? And we thought about this idea for several years, and in maybe 2021, we're invited to do the show at the American University Museum with the small hitch of it was about 3 times more space than we had expected. So we made a lot of work for this and decided that we were just going to pull out the stops and make it in all different media, depending on how we wanted to say what, and also to make it as accessible for the audience as possible. I'm going to wrap up. I talked about, I guess, that I was in Artomatic, that I worked on the Wilson Building collection. I also was a founding member of the Mid-City Artists. And Ellen and I did a project called Zeitgeist, which was we curated these shows. We did 4 different shows where we sort of picked a topic and invited a bunch of Washington artists to participate in those. And I love that, again, it's part of my wanting to pull people together. So lastly, there was some work that I did during the pandemic that I thought also relates to this story of surface and looking in and different pieces. But like a lot of people, I just, sort of put my head down and made a lot of work during the pandemic. And this is work from a couple of series during that time. These are watercolors that I did during that time, which might look like trees to you, but they might just look like lines to you. I loved making them. I spent a lot of time walking around during that pandemic time period. And then lastly, I'm just going to throw this up there. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, but because this isn't really what's next, but maybe it's what's next. But during this whole pandemic time, I also started foraging materials and weaving with plant matter rather than steel wire. And as part of my idea that I want to not really bring any fresh raw materials into my studio, I started teaching myself how to weave different things. So this, you can see different woven small pieces. Some of them are woven with copper, and some plant matter and cordage that I make. And, I'm actually super excited that I've got really nothing on my plate right now, and I'm just going to experiment for a while. And so that's about it.
Sondra, that was absolutely fantastic. It was wonderful to see that kind of the progression and how all the influences kind of stuck together and permeated over the years. You mentioned kind of like the idea of the artist as a second career and how that kind of affects you and your kind of work ethic and taking your previous professions and kind of embedding them into your art. And we've had people like Tim, of course, all 3 of the Glass School boys, and people like Steve Wanna. And I actually found a lot of similarities between, especially you and Steve Wanna, from more of a scientific kind of background and putting that into your art. Do you feel that artists who don't have that kind of, I don't know, other interests, let's say, are kind of suffering or not suffering, it's not, maybe not the right word, but are at a disadvantage than, somebody who has all of this experience in other fields and other professions?
Wow, that's such a great question, because I always think about it sort of in reverse of that. That I sort of came into my art career thinking I was so far behind everyone else. I tell this story a lot. When I first left my job, one of the first things I did was I actually took a class at the Washington Glass School, and I thought everybody else was a full-time artist that I knew who was out in the art world, and that I was like just not able to make it work. I could not juggle my job and making art. And I thought everybody else is out there doing it. I don't understand why I can't make this work. And I have a huge respect for everybody who is out there juggling their job and making art, first of all. And the other thing is that even though I was always considered the outsider in taking classes, I was never a fine arts major. So I would take a class and they would be like, oh, you know, you're just, it's not, you just do your thing over there. And I mean, the reality of it was that my work didn't look like anyone else's work. And, you know, maybe that was the advantage I had, was that my work didn't look like other people's work. But I don't know that I bring anything more than, I mean, for me, I bring a huge administrative load. You know, people often ask me if my background in my previous career in marketing is, you know, that brings me such an advantage. And I have to admit, I actually keep the brakes on. Well, I mean, I can't help that there's one little piece of my brain that is the marketing part. Like, where's this work going to go and what are we going to do with it? But I don't turn up the volume on that piece of it. And I certainly could, but I don't want my art making to be a business. Although it is a business, right?
I think it was more like to me, I saw the science as more of an advantage than the marketing. Like you have, I think what I'm getting at is, I feel like sometimes if you are an artist, fine artist, master's degree kind of thing in painting or whatever art material it is, that you almost lack things to say. Does that make sense? Like you're just
Yeah, but
so focused on the
that to me is
craft.
just a curiosity thing. I mean, I think that
Right.
my science is just about the fact that I'm super curious about all kinds of things. Um, and and I don't know that my science, I gravitated towards science and data because that I was good at that, but I don't I don't know why it was of interest to me, right? I don't know why I'm interested in knowing what plants are or naming the trees. I mean, I walk through Washington and I like name trees as I walk around. That's like weird to do that, but I do it all the time. I name plants, I name trees, and I think I'm just trying to find my place in the world. So I don't know that it's really my background as much as it's my nature.
I like that. Thanks. Any other questions?
I'm sorry. All I could think of when you said that was like, "Hi, Loretta." Yeah. "Hi, John," and then not like the Latin nomenclature of it. No, like that.
Well, it's funny, the Latin part is why I'm not in science. That's what I said is the words tripped me up, is I was curious about all these things, but when it came to learning Latin or chemistry, those things, the memorizing and that other language it put the kibosh on my science learning immediately.
I'm so glad because we might not have had all this otherwise. I mean, I just, what a waste if you were slaving away in some lab, you know, doing research.
Right.
I was really blown away by this. It's beautiful, layered, layered work, and it makes me feel good and it makes me curious when I see it. I really want to see it in person. Anyway, thanks.
Feel free to reach out to me and come by for a studio visit. I'm right in DuPont Circle, and now that we're back out in the world, I'm happy to have people come by and
we're out because of science, which is good.
Yeah.
Right. This was fantastic, Sondra. I like all of it, and I was particularly touched by your human flood. I think that's so current, of course, current. But can you tell us a little bit about what was your thinking behind that? You mentioned some about migrating populations who are losing their habitat, basically.
Well, I'm happy. I mean, I could have talked the entire time about the human flood. So I told Jordan that I was going to, you know, keep the human flood sort of brief, because there's so much to talk about. I mean, the topic itself was really about there are already millions and millions of people who are on the move because the place that they have lived is no longer habitable. And I mean, you know, 90% of the people who are on the move because of climate change are internally displaced people. They're actually not moving from country to country. They're within their own country. But the question still is what are we to do with them? And I mean, for me, it's also part of the housing crisis that we have. Whether you're moving for climate reasons or not. And doing the show, I mean, it was really overwhelming for both Ellen and I. Topically, it was a difficult topic to deal with, but then the situation in Gaza happened, and Ukraine happened all during the time we were working on this, and you have so many people on the move for so many reasons. I mean, whether it's those people or it's constant war, constant wildfire, tornadoes, hurricanes, all of these things that are affecting people needing to move, and us not providing the kind of support that is probably necessary for a society to be providing. So there were so many things to say about it. That's why we took so many different approaches to the work that we did for it. And I mentioned briefly that Ellen and I had curated the Zeitgeist shows over the years, and the Zeitgeist shows this was actually a perfect Zeitgeist show. And I sort of joked that we made the Zeitgeist show and we just made all the work ourselves rather than bring any other artists into it. And we did it the way we would do a Zeitgeist show, which is we had lots of different media and lots of different ways for the audience to access the information. There's a catalog, there's a complete website, we run social media on it, and the pieces themselves were very different. And I think, though, that when we started working on it, we were both pretty dismayed, very dismayed. And I think that we've come out of it with a slightly more hopeful concept that there are things that people are doing on climate change that are making some progress, and that it's just a lot more, it's talked about a lot more in the media now. When we started in 2017, this wasn't a topic. Climate refugees wasn't even a term that was being used.
Right. Yes, this is amazing. Someone mentioned, can you give us the name of your studio so people can arrange to visit you?
Well, they can go to my website at sondranarkin.com and then just send me a contact through.
Wonderful. I hope that answers the question. And a couple of people had to sign off, but they're saying how much they enjoyed it. I have a dumb question. What do you do with all the materials after a show? Where do you keep, if you don't disassemble, or ouch?
Well, most of it is disassembled. So the pieces, all the wire pieces go back to 10 in a garbage bag. And so there's 10 in, and I always use clear garbage bags. So that's a good tip for you. Don't ever put your work in black garbage bags because it looks like garbage. And they're, up in the attic.
Oh, you have an attic.
And but I actually don't keep a lot of inventory on hand. I really try. I mean, even though I make a lot of work, and I do try to place it as much as I can. I maybe that's the marketing piece of my mind. Keep it affordable, and I try to get it out there. I don't want to keel over with 1,000 pieces left in my studio.
You don't want the flood to be inward.
Yeah. So
good for you.
So that's and I mean, it's no surprise to anyone if I say I have a database where I keep track of all my work, in a database that has a photograph and that tells me where it is, if the person has purchased it, or if it's located somewhere in my studio.
So you said something that piqued my curiosity about your prices. So, art doesn't have a reputation for being cheap or even affordable. But you said you keep your prices reachable or approachable. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I feel that art should be accessible to everyone. So I have always tried to keep my pricing. It's not at all related to the effort that goes into it. I think it would be impossible. And I want it to be out in the world. So I try to keep it in more of an impulse buy price range. It's always been a little bit of a challenge when I work with galleries because it's not a lot for the galleries. to keep my prices as low as I would like to keep them. And then once it's at a certain price in the market, you have to keep it at that price, of course, whether it's in the gallery or in your studio. But yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I make a lot of little art.
Yeah, good for you. That's so interesting to me, and it speaks to me more than upping the price all the time. Thank you so much. This was
I have a
amazing.
question.
Barbara,
It looks like you're
from
incredibly
Rita, sorry.
incredibly productive. And I was curious, like when you're working on a series, do you work all day? How much time do you spend on each piece? I mean, you were talking about 600 pieces in something, or a 300 piece series. How does your work day go?
Well, I spend pretty much all day in my studio, and it's funny, I smiled when you said that, because I don't really think of myself as that productive lately, because I get worn out sometimes from these bigger shows. So the human flood really took it out of me. So I haven't made a whole lot since we put that show up in February. I've made a lot of string. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. This is string that I make out of yucca. So I might spend hours listening to an audiobook and making string that I'm going to use at some later date, but I don't yet know when I'm going to use it. And, and when I make a series, I think I'm froze up. When I make a series, I tend to, work on a bunch at a time. So I don't work on one piece and then another piece. I probably prep 10 pieces of paper or board or whatever I'm doing, and then I work on 10 pieces at a time. So with the wax in particular, there's sort of steps to it. And so it lends itself to making a bunch of pieces at the same time, because you have to let it do things in between, whether it's the shellac has to dry and you have to, things are drying for a certain amount of time. So I think it's what I do every day. But there's a lot of days I don't do it now.
Sondra, I have a question about materials. When you are kind of planning let's call it a piece or pieces, a series, which comes first to you? Is it the material that influences the idea, or the idea that influences the material that you're using to achieve said concept? Or does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a chicken or the egg situation, but I get like you've used wax for so long, but do you ever find like, oh, this idea is perfect for wax, or is perfect for wire, perfect for string? Or is it just like you get kind of influenced by the material and say, this relates itself to this idea that's been rattling around?
I think that it's the material. I mean, I think it is, I'm working in a material and then the idea sort of formulates based on my working on the material. I think that often I'm working and I don't even know what the idea is. And the idea sort of comes along as part of it. I do listen to audiobooks and podcasts and things like that when I work. And sometimes the ideas formulate out of that. I have a piece I made years ago and I laugh when I think about it. I still call it the Pompeii piece, because I was listening to some book on Pompeii while I was working on this piece. I don't think it has anything to do with Pompeii, but I can totally relate that concept to the piece. So I think that I usually work with materials first. Like right now, what I'm going to do with all this plant matter, I really want to try and figure out how to make something bigger. I don't want to make little baskets. That's not really my thing. I've been making these little baskets and giving them away as fast as I make them, but I've been making them to learn different techniques. They're not very good. And so the idea is to get better at them and to get better at whatever the connection of plant matter is, and then make some pieces out of it.
Sondra, I read somewhere, I can't remember where, that those periods when we're castigating ourselves for not doing anything active in the studio are really important times, because our subconscious is assembling ideas. And we're not even conscious of it yet. So we have to let that flow happen and accept it and just take nature walks or whatever. Continue your little, repetitive hand activities and so on, but don't chastise yourself because you're not creating something new, because your mind is just working on it at a level that's below your consciousness. And then
Okay.
you learn to accept that and not feel bad about it.
Okay, I'm going to take that to heart. I won't. I'm definitely in a period where I would say I'm vacuuming up.
There you go.
I'm vacuuming up. I'm trying to figure out what the next thing is. And that's great.
Because you have a very, low capital letter Catholic view of the world. Things are assaulting you with ideas from many directions, and your brain needs that time and to contemplate all of that and amalgamate it in a way that you can express creatively. So keep on. I love the human flood. Jordan knows I'm very concerned about the state of the planet. I haven't figured out a way to express it myself. So I appreciate hearing all of your efforts to bring. I think we should, Washington, D.C., every gallery should have a human flow. Bring Ai Weiwei in, because he's got a whole movie on that you've probably seen. And every gallery get Washington, D.C. legislators focused on the predicament of the whole world, not just this little country called the United States. We don't even accept Americas as part of our neighbors yet. It's really, we're so provincial, it's frightening. Anyway, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for those words. I definitely will take them to heart and won't chastise myself. There's a lot of input. There's a lot of input happening.
Well, I want to say thank you again, Sondra, for an incredible talk. We'll have to have you come back as a host at some point and introduce us to some of your incredible art connections that you've made over the years. I want to remind everyone, in 2 weeks, we have Dawn Whitmore talking about her work. So please come back in 2 weeks for another Art Clinic Online. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Have a great weekend.